experiencing on women's rights and also children's rights. So by he who shall not be named. So these two presentations I think are very, very interesting, and what we thought we would do is we would keep the discussions to the end of both papers, since there are some linkages, but also separate components, very much so. So I will start by introducing the first presenter. Natalie Momentum has focused her professional career on working with children and families with both mental illness and developmental disabilities. She's currently the manager for the Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health Department at Kings County Hospital, where she oversees LMSWs, CSWs, and caseworkers. The staff are located in 3 child inpatient services: early childhood, adolescent, and first break psychosis, 2 crisis programs, an outpatient mental health program, a developmental evaluation clinic, and a school-based mental health program. I'm surprised you have time to do this. I don't know. Natalie achieved a Bachelor of Arts as a double major in psychology and anthropology from Long Island University. She obtained her Master's of Social Work from NYU and completed a continued education certification in applied behavioral analysis. She wanted to teach and provide guidance to incoming social workers on techniques in working with children and adolescents, and is currently in the Doctorate of Social Work program at NYU and will be entering into her 2nd year in the fall. So,
thank you.
Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Aiello. So I'm going to be reading a little bit of a paper that I'm currently working on, specifically on the oppressed child and standpoint theory. So children are expected to follow rules set forth by their parents, teachers, and other authority figures. They must have complete trust in decisions made by these authority figures, and if they are questioning or resistant, they are occasionally labeled oppositional. This presentation discusses where authority may turn into unnecessary restraint, suppressing the voice of the youth and not allowing them to have a position of their own. We cannot deny the differences in various cultures on the perceptions of the ability and the treatment of the child, causing different developments and or identification of children as productive members of their society or community. So in this presentation, we're going to explore a little bit of the history of Western culture on the child development and how this may have contributed to the oppression of youth. I will also show the importance of incorporating children into a standpoint theory perspective. The 2014 U.S. Census national projections show that by 2020, children under the age of 18 will make up 22% of the population, in comparison to the 61% of adults who are ages 18 to 64, and 17% being 65 and older. Children are only further impacted not only by their age group, but also by their cultural origin. Although in the United States, minority individuals, including biracial individuals, have increased in the years past, children of non-Hispanic white background remain a minority. Children under the age of 18 make up 13% of African American youth, 4% Asian American youth, biracial group make up 4%, and of Hispanic Latino origin, 25%. These youth have to have an awareness of not only how being a child may impact them, but also how they may be treated as an ethnic minority. Within each cultural demographic, there are varied perceptions on the notion of a child's independent decision-making ability. These perceptions, reflected by the belief and cultural system of the parent, become entrenched in their thinking about the child's ability and overall competency to make decisions based on these cultural perspectives. The philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was the first to identify a standpoint after studying the master-slave relationship and how this power differential creates a different perspective within each group. Standpoint theory progressed from a theory-based perspective to one that explores the communication between groups and the behaviors that they manifest. When researching standpoint theory, various standpoint epistemologies are evident, such as feminist standpoint theory, black feminist standpoint theory, and queer theory. A commonality among them, which is necessary for a standpoint, is the power differential that exists between the group of power and the subgroup. For these subgroups, their identity and shared experience is shaped by this power differential. The standpoint aim is to inform social science practice, positively change society, and provide another view than that of the dominant power. So we utilize Sandra Harding's identification of the androcentric knowledge identifier as the need to understand the perspective of women. We should also apply this to the adult centrism and see the need to incorporate a child standpoint perspective. But in identifying the need to incorporate a child standpoint, We must also take pieces from Patricia Hill Collins' identification of standpoint theory as a societal, historically based oppression. So one oppressed group is underreported in the standpoint literature: children. In fact, I had difficulty finding articles or any discussion of them from a standpoint perspective. Is this because children are not viewed as an oppressed minority? Is it too controversial to posit that children are an opposed people? I recognize that personal feelings around parenting, cultural perspectives on the needs of children, and overall personal or clinical ideologies around child development may make this presentation difficult to accept. All that I ask is, independent of personal positions, that we open up the discussion of incorporating children into a standpoint perspective. Like any critical theory, we have to understand how the history of an oppressed group has helped shape how this group continues to remain with little to no voice or power. So we're going to go a little bit into the history. So notable writing by Philippe Aris, and I always say his name incorrectly, speaks the notion that children were not always referenced as such. Aris identifies how children were seen as miniature adults, as illustrated in various artworks. He also speaks how child development classifiers, such as infancy and youth, were associated with different developmental ages than that of today. He posits the change of identifying children as we know them today was out of necessity post-Middle Ages because of high infant mortality rates, the movement towards a nuclear family, and focus on childhood norms. So disciplining one's child has been a topic of discussion for centuries, with a debate over the parental right to address disobedience. Notably, in the United States in 1646, the Massachusetts Stubborn Child Act was passed to permit parents to put their, quote, stubborn, and that is either misbehaved or oppositional child to death. Before the 18th century, children were subjected to harsh treatment and or ignored. Children who manifested behavioral or psychiatric issues, inconsistency with society's norms, were seen as possessed, leading to imposed religious ceremonies to rid themselves of the evils that they possessed. The 19th century saw a shift in the viewpoint of children as described by individuals like Jean-Marc Guittard, Lita Hollingworth, and Benjamin Rush. Their contributions allowed for viewing the child with behavioral discontrol or disturbance as a byproduct of inept treatment by their parents and stages of neurodevelopment. Focus also turned to understanding the mind of the developing child. This movement began to see the child in a different perspective, identifying the factors that impact the child development from more than just a religious and mere obedience standpoint. By the 20th century, the Children's Bureau under the Department of Labor was created to address infant mortality rates and child labor. Prior to this, children were expected to work to contribute financially for their families, as was dictated by their families or out of necessity. The National Child Labor Committee was developed in 1904 as a proponent for child labor reform, as children were working up to 60 hours a week. However, it was not until the Fair Labor Standards of 1938 that regulation of child labor was enacted. The rise in clinical theories by the 20th century helped provide definitions of treatment for behavioral issues manifested by children. J.B. Watson developed a child behavioral theory approach that suggests to parents that they were to shape the child into whatever they thought they wanted through the control behaviors using punishment and rewards. Although a step in the right direction in identifying the importance of child development as playing a role in child behavior, there could be a sentiment among parents of not allowing the youth to vocalize their feelings around types of treatment or alternative options that may be available. Now, although a historical position, let us explore a personal recount of this in today's clinical climate from one of my clients. The youth I was seeing was a 15-year-old Caribbean-American male who was voluntarily admitted to the psychiatric inpatient area that I supervised. The word voluntary implies that the youth had a decision in his admission. However, in this context, his voluntary admission was his mother signing him into the psychiatric facility versus the youth's right to choose an inpatient stay. He was admitted for school refusal and aggressive behaviors at home. So I began working with him, completing individual and family therapy for the duration of his hospitalization, which was over 3 months. What was uncovered was the youth's behavior were in the context of severe family discord between him and his mother. The relationship was further compounded by his blaming her for his father no longer being in the picture. Although the level of his aggression was inappropriate, his behaviors were typically triggered by statements made by his mother that he needed to, quote, be put away in a residential. My patient was angered that he was the identified patient without his mother also getting help for her, as she also suffered from undiagnosed mental health needs. Yet here was my patient, voluntarily committed in a psychiatric hospital for an issue which at the core was familial. We cannot deny his accountability for the level of aggression he would manifest during their fighting, though. Yet we cannot deny that my patient had no say in other ways to remedy the situation, such as family therapy in an outpatient setting, prior to psychiatric voluntary hospitalization. This may be a case example of the effects of parental decisions around treatment and parenting style today, but during the 20th century, clinical theories around parent-child styles also began to be explored. Bauman explored how various parenting styles affect the overall development of youth into maladaptive or adaptive individuals. And as a result, these parenting styles, Bauman also explored how they impacted the development of these children. Two key clinicians and advocates wrote for the rights of children and the historical background of children. Lloyd de Mouse developed a comprehensive review of the history of childhood from late Roman years to the 19th century. He explored the psychological effects of being a child from a historical perspective and began the discussion of a child being seen as irrelevant. He also discussed the role of the child in the familial context and these respective roles. In 2012, Elizabeth Young Burrell published her book, Childism. This was an impressive book identifying the need to develop an awareness of the rights of children. She coined the phrase childism to identify the ism that exists in children. And like any repressed group, children must come together to advocate for their rights. However, what they require first is an awareness of what is wrong, an understanding of how society, their family, or their communities have kept them oppressed. As we see from this brief history, ideas about childhood and children have changed with each century, making the topic of childhood, what created a child, and the rights of children an adult-driven discussion. We must explore what factors can impact the rights of children today. In exploring these factors, we need to explore the wants of the child, their belief of what information they should be told, or their own perceived notions of the child's abilities, all the while expanding on the innate potential of that youth. So what do we consider in the rights of children? So oppression is defined as a subjecting burdensome imposition by an authority figure or one in power, in not allowing the child to express themselves openly or have a stance against what they are being required to do, like, or become. Children are beginning to experience oppression. Smeta stated, adolescents are attempting to coordinate their beliefs about the legitimacy of culturally variable social conventions and the validity of moral prescriptions with a desire to stake claims to areas of self-regulation and personal control that are required or desired to become an independent adult in their cultural setting. In this, we must allow children continue to develop by using their rights to explore their choices that they have before themselves of what they want versus one imposed by those of the authority figures. So to identify whether children are a marginalized group, let us reference back to the census population of children being 22%. The predominant group would be that of the adults who have the power to determine the rights of decision of the child. Yet, under the United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child, children have a number of legislative rights that are not always followed. Under Article 13, 14, and 16 of the legislative rights of children, they have the right to expression, including seeking and receiving of information, freedom of thought, and right to privacy irrelevant of the age of the youth. Although these are the legislative rights of the child, information provided to children currently are filtered through the lens of the adult. Therefore, the child must learn to comply with the ideology and requirements set forth by the adult, even though it may not be a position of their own. The child is viewed as an underdeveloped individual in the decisions of their rights. Research now shows, though, that cognitive control over decision-making is not, in fact, underdeveloped, but rather manifests in different facets of cognitive control in each developmental age. This is also impacted by the child-parent engagement, which would foster neurocognitive functioning and effective decision-making abilities. We have learned that children need to be protected, and this protection comes via the adults that are around them. The adult will then provide structure around what they believe to be protecting the youth, limiting certain rights to choose. Now, I recognize that different developmental ages show different socio-emotional cognitive ability. However, the 6-month-old's inability to have effective communication, the 6-year-old's limited vocabulary, or the 16-year-old's rebellious individuation does not diminish the respective emotional state, reactions, ideas, and internalizations of the surroundings they experience. Perry, Smith, and Thomas in their foreword clearly illustrated this, stating, children have their own view on their best interests, a great capacity to make decisions, the right to speak, and the right to be heard. Young children should be recognized as members of families, communities, and societies with their own concerns, interests, and point of view. Now for the adult reader, struggling to accept that a child does not present with a cognitive developmental ability to make a logical choice, the adult must also be cognizant of the possibility that the mere act of the choice may increase the child's internal loci of adult-like reasoning. Maintaining the position and putting into practice that the child is but a child and cannot make a decision independently is not allowing the youth to explore their positions about their own belief system. In fact, it is causing youth to stay in a regressed state. As adults, the idea that we know what is best because of our chronological age and experience that it lends, it is taking away the child's rights and their own building of their childhood experience. Now, other cultures may expose youth to more decision-making abilities. Garcia evaluated the autonomy of children in Peruvian indigenous peoples, specifically the Augura, where it was found that these children imitated the role of their elders, leading to increased autonomy tied to their social responsibilities. One could postulate this tie to social responsibility is leading to the development of necessary roles in their community. Taking this cultural practice into account in assessing the importance of autonomy via role importance in society, have we, in Western culture, minimized the role of the child in continuing to infantilize them due to subconscious or even conscious beliefs that youth are not yet functional or contributory to the greater society? If so, maintaining this belief will keep youth in a subjugated state, never allowing them to be more than onlookers of the adult representation of what society should be. But children grow up, and therein lies the difficulty in accepting the children's standpoint perspective. Adults must acknowledge that children mature, and a new group of children presenting in similar circumstances needs to be supported in their powerlessness and given a continued voice for the masses. Children's perspectives may be distorted in scholarly work, as the individuals writing the articles are doing so with their old childhood histories now seen through an adult lens, which may distort the true representation of youth. As you're listening, you may be saying, but I'm a good parent, I'm a good teacher, I'm a good social worker, I'm a good clinician, and I always have the best interest of the child or my child in mind. Yet the individual response is not being argued here. It is the rights of children that are imposed by the adult without the voice of the child. On a more extreme level, to illustrate this point, what are the children who have suffered or died under that authority of adults? To lend a less intense clinical example from my work with children, there's a 9-year-old boy who I worked with in an outpatient setting who came into treatment due to anxiety. After developing a rapport, he disclosed his parents making the choices of what information should be disclosed to him about their relationship. What they failed to realize that this was causing him to have perceptive thinking around what was being kept from him. They were separated and co-parenting. Similarly, this youth was not allowed to make a determination of when, or if at all, he was going to spend time with his father. Instead, he was told he must go to his father's home because of the courts, and that was his father. What sessions together found was his anxiety was not caused by school, as the mother speculated, but by the fear of going to his father's home and the information that was not being told to him. His father, who was occasionally supportive, was at other times emotionally abusive. This led my patient to have self-esteem issues and anxiety issues around academia, as his father would call him stupid and various other names. So here was a boy where the courts and his parents determined for him what was best, yet he suffered in the hand of well-meaning adult figures. All people want the ability to make their own decisions and be given choices. What this allows is an increased sense of pleasure and autonomy. When removing the ability to make these choices, negative manifestations occur behaviorally and physiologically. So in the development of a child standpoint theory, the points illustrated in this presentation are but a piece of what we must consider. A standpoint position identifies that they are partial and therefore may coexist with another standpoints. So given this understanding, we must look how history has led to separating the adults from children and explore how setting up this age differential also created a power differential. Sociologically, different ages create different abilities in children to exercise their rights, yet all children have a basic set of human rights. We must redefine each age category's rights. Is it a Western philosophy about children and their inability to make decisions in comparison to other cultures? This must be further investigated to explore whether Western culture maintains children in an infantile state to ensure continued power and control and/or making it easier for parents to parent. Let's begin to ask the child what is important to them and what the misconceptions adults have of them are. From a clinical perspective, let's keep in mind the powerlessness that children may be experiencing at home or at school. This may be part of the stressor leading to the behavioral and psychiatric issues before you. The youth's behavior may be a manifestation of the identified position of oppression with which they have been placed by the authority figures in their lives, and perhaps stunting their exploratory nature or independent differentiation. Lastly, while children are an oppressed minority group, we cannot disregard the subgroups that exist within children and how they are also impacted. Exploration discussion is required into the rights of children into mental health treatment and psychiatric hospitalizations, LGBTQ youth rights as well, children who are recent immigrants, and how research for children may also be a factor in solidifying our child standpoint perspective. Children's needs must be understood from their level, essentially meeting them where they are versus the adults positing about their needs and their rights. So as Leota et al. Said, we are born to choose.
Okay, as we discussed, we're going to move to the second paper, and then we'll have discussion at the end. So I'm pleased to introduce Rebecca Harrington. She maintains a full-time psychotherapy practice in New York City, working with adolescents and adults. She is on faculty at Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Study Center, where she is an instructor, supervisor, and training analyst. Her most recent article is, quote, Friend Request, The Analytic Frame Revisited, unquote, which was published last year in Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Over the past few years, Rebecca has been presenting on the topic of voluntary and involuntary childlessness and is currently completing a manuscript for publication.
Hi. So, I was having my nails done recently when the manicurist, noticing my wedding ring, asked me, "Do you have kids?" When I replied that I didn't, she sympathetically reassured me, "Don't worry, it will happen." Ever since I was married, in the year 2000, I've been on the receiving end of innumerable comments about my childlessness. They're often accompanied by looks ranging from compassion to judgment to pity, envy, to downright condescension. Although I've become accustomed to these often inappropriate and always unsolicited remarks, they still sting. I certainly am not the only woman who has encountered this type of interaction. I hear about them from my female childless friends and patients, regardless of sexual orientation. This seems particularly true for those wearing wedding rings and those whose fertility is perceived by others to be on the brink of expiration. Notably, I rarely hear about comments like these from my male childless friends or patients, or from my childless husband. I know that some women find such remarks comforting or encouraging, while others find them critical or rude, intrusive or insensitive, hurtful or cruel. I imagine that each woman's reaction depends in part on whether she's child-free by choice, as in she's made a conscious decision, whether she's child-free by circumstance, because of infertility or other involuntary reasons, or if she's child-free by chance, as in she might have liked to reproduce, but time ran out for various reasons. The manicurist in question undoubtedly intended to be kind, and I did take her so-called reassurance as such, even though it irritated me. But this interaction is meaningful in the broader sense because it exemplifies the prevalence and pervasiveness of what sociologist Nancy Russo referred to in 1976 as the Motherhood Mandate, which is the societal belief that motherhood is a woman's raison d'etre and all women want children, along with the concomitant pressure to have them. I don't question the fact that women who want children are in the majority. My intention in presenting on this topic is twofold. First, to shine a brighter light on childlessness, and specifically those who are voluntarily childless. And that's a population that is too often an object of scorn in our culture, and to date has received inadequate attention, at least in the psychoanalytic literature. Second, I also want to highlight a life decision that patients make, procreation, that sometimes might go without sufficient analytic exploration because it's so normal. But first, I think it's important to consider the issue of compulsory motherhood within the context of the histories of childhood and family. This is useful because the current psychological and social beliefs regarding children reflect a continually evolving process rather than a perspective that has existed unchanged for centuries. So let's go back to ancient Rome. So children, to say the least, in ancient Rome, were not always valued in the ways they tend to be today. French archaeologist and historian Paul Venn gives us a detailed description of how people in the Roman Empire regarded and treated their children. He explains, infants came into the world only as the head of the family willed. Contraception, abortion, the exposure, which is the abandonment of freeborn infants, and infanticide of slaves' children were common and perfectly legal practices in ancient Rome. As soon as a baby was born, the midwife would put the infant on the ground, and the father, if he planned to keep it, he would pick it up. If he picked up the baby, the infant went directly into the care of a wet nurse and teacher who then raised the child until puberty. Children were not nurtured or cared for by their own parents. If the father did not pick up the newborn, it meant that he did not accept the child, and anyone who wanted it could take it. Not surprisingly, most children who were, quote, exposed were, did not survive. Not so many people wanted these exposed children, babies. Malformed infants were routinely either abandoned or drowned. Husbands who suspected their wives of adultery exposed any children they thought were born out of such unions. Poor people often abandoned their babies due to economic concerns. Your paper goes really fitting in well here. In general, Romans cared little, if at all, about bloodlines or biological ties to their children. Although I have to say that history reflects the male perspective. I would be curious to go back to ancient Rome and ask the mothers what their feelings were, but so Romans cared little about the blood ties. What they valued was the preservation and continuation of the family name, and they were unsentimental about whether it was carried on by a biological or adopted child. Adoption, in fact, was quite common. It was akin to arranging a good marriage for a daughter, as it came with the same types of benefits. Moving forward in history to the evolution of the concept of family from medieval to modern times, education was valued in ancient times. It was lost during the Middle Ages, and then it reemerged at the beginning of the modern era. The French historian Philippe Ariès identifies this return to education, which was forged by the elite classes, as the primary marker that established the nuclear family we know today. In medieval times, childhood was not, and Natalie was just speaking about this, childhood was not privileged or considered special in any way. Children were considered small adults who, from around the time they turned 7, mixed with adults and the adult world. Not only did children and adults work alongside each other, but they also socialized and intermingled in taverns, brothels, and other such places where we today would not think to bring children or leave them unattended. Apprenticeship was the way of life in these days, and this meant that children didn't live at home with their parents, but instead in the homes of the adults for and with whom they worked. This created a feeling of separation and distance between parents and their offspring. Children lived and worked with other children's parents. Parents lived and worked with other people's children. Society was communal, and privacy barely existed for anyone. As Ariès summarizes, the movement of collective life carried along in a single torrent all ages and classes, leaving nobody any time for solitude and privacy. In these crowded collective existences, there was no room for a private sector. The family fulfilled a function. It ensured the transmission of life, property, and names, but it did not penetrate very far into human sensibility. Over time, though, the middle and upper classes began to value education and seek it for their children. Starting in the 15th century, instead of sending their children to apprenticeships, wealthy people began to enroll them in schools. This meant that for the first time, children began living with or near their parents, and by the 17th century, middle and upper class families were organized around their children. The relationship between parents and offsprings by the 17th century had become much more intimate and sentimental. This significant shift in the family structure led to major changes in how houses were set up and lived in, as well as in social customs and etiquette. By the 18th century, the privacy of the family, including the separation of it from the larger community and a new emphasis on domesticity, became a priority and societal norm for the elite classes. People also began incorporating more birth control measures so they can focus on the children they already had. By the 19th century, the majority of people the majority was poor, continued to live like families did in the Middle Ages. However, the model of family life that had been established by the elite classes eventually took hold of the rest of society. Ultimately, the privacy of family life, which still dominates in the Western world today, became the norm for all branches of society regardless of class. In more recent times, psychoanalysis and psychological theories of human development have historically suggested that parenthood is a developmental achievement, and the causes of infertility have been historically attributed to psychological problems in women. Our case studies are rife with happily ever after endings, in which the female patient is deemed ready for termination when she's found a man, married, and become pregnant. We've all read those, right? Benedek's classic paper, Parenthood as a Developmental Stage, is a prime example of how psychoanalysis privileged marriage and procreation. Pines proposed that pregnancy and motherhood are part of the female's separation individuation process, and thus important developmental achievements for entering adulthood. Erickson identified generativity as a crucial part of healthy human development in adults, but narrowly classified reproduction and child rearing as essential components of this psychosocial stage. Psychoanalytic and developmental theories, of course, have greatly evolved since these ideas were first proposed. Even Benedek eventually reconsidered parts of her original thesis. My concern, however, is that these early concepts continue to underpin our theory because reproduction is a normal and normalized, expected aspect of civilization and culture. We need look no further than our literature for proof that some contemporary theorists continue to posit outdated philosophies of psychogenic infertility, as in the female mind as locus of infertility. In my clinical work, I usually ask patients considering parenthood to articulate their thoughts and feelings about why they want to have a child. And I should be clear by now, this question would have very different implications if asked during Roman or medieval times. My question sometimes takes people off guard because I believe my query inherently challenges contemporary internalized societal norms and expectations. Some of these patients respond as if my question shouldn't even be a question. The answer is obvious. I once had a young female patient flat out respond, because that's what I'm supposed to do. My patient was being neither sarcastic nor ironic. I wonder how many women have children because they don't believe that this is a choice. How many dissociate their ambivalence? And how does this dissociated ambivalence impact the ways they feel about, treat, and raise their children? In our pro-natalist society, reproduction and motherhood have become highly commercialized and politicized, even though we've created very little social policy and structure to support the substantial needs of families and mothers. The idea that being a mother is the hardest and most important job in the world is part of our cultural rhetoric. Although paradoxically, as sociologist Karen Wilson notes, motherhood is seen as honorable and central to womanhood, while the day-to-day work involved, the mothering, garners little respect or material support from society. In this way, a clear divide exists between normative psychological beliefs and sociological norms. Nevertheless, consumer culture today perpetuates the sense that our options are limitless if we are able and willing to spend money pursuing what we want. Femininity and womanhood are often equated with motherhood. Reproduction is privileged at all cost. The messaging to women, or more specifically to socioeconomically advantaged women, is you can have it all. This means that a woman no longer needs to choose between career or family. She can have them both, or she should have children even if she has a career, or even more implicitly, she should want both. The overt and covert pressures of societal norms and expectations can also interfere with a woman's conscious and unconscious sense of personal, individual freedom in considering her own reproductive goals, desires, and options. As Theresa, you already mentioned, the political climate in the US today only contributes to these problems. Planned Parenthood is under serious threat of being defunded. The White House is currently, or maybe they already did, try to unroll the provision in the Affordable Care Act that provides free birth control. Large swaths of the country are increasingly restricting women's access to abortion, birth control, gynecological, and health care, especially in rural and economically depressed areas. But the fact is, childlessness is on the rise in the US. According to a 2010 Pew Research Center report, 1 out of 5 American women will not have children, and that's compared to the 1970s when it was 1 out of 10. This report does not further break down the numbers to indicate how many of the women in the US are childless by choice, circumstance, or chance. However, a 2013 Gallup poll found that Americans who are voluntarily childless make up 5% of the population. So while voluntarily childless Americans are in the minority, they still represent a significant and possibly growing portion of the US population. In spite of the dropping birth rates in the US, research published as recently as this year finds that the stigma perpetuated against childless adults has not decreased. Interestingly, like previous studies on the correlation between parenthood and well-being, the 2016 World Happiness Report found that overall, the relationship between parenthood and life satisfaction is generally negative throughout the world. I wonder if this indicates that in actual lived experience, some semblance of the ancient and medieval attitudes towards children remains buried within our contemporary belief systems. The World Happiness Report's finding, however, does not seem to reduce the social stigma childless people still confront. It might actually even do the opposite. It might strengthen the stale binary and labeling of childless women as selfish and mothers as selfless. The Pew Research Center report that I mentioned earlier states that a 2009 poll found that 38% of the public believes that the increase in childlessness in the US is, quote, bad for society. This is a 9% increase from a similar survey they did that took place only 2 years before. This suggests that not only is social stigma against the childless not decreasing despite rising rates of childlessness, but that instead intolerance of it is increasing. Social biases continue to skew strongly against people who choose not to have children. Research shows that people who are child-free tend to be the targets of stigmatization and moral outrage. In the sociologist Erwin Goffman's development of stigma theory, he points out that those on the margins of society may be seen by so-called normals, as he puts it, as in people who fit into the mainstream, as not quite human. The psychoanalyst Ken Corbett explains that those in the majority often need those on the margins to be normal, so their differences don't feel threatening. Indeed, peruse any reader's comments section after a given blog post on this topic, and you'll inevitably find infinite evidence of the Motherhood Mandate expressed through anger, criticism, sexism, and heterocentrism. In our social hierarchy, the majority, in this case people with children, holds the power to define what is normative. I wish I could say that the mental health profession stands apart, that we push back against compulsory motherhood. One of the cornerstones of psychoanalysis is open-minded, open-ended inquiry. Like many psychoanalysts, I believe that our goal is to try not to assume what a given patient is feeling or the reasons why she might feel a particular way. We value the individual and try to aid each patient in reducing psychological suffering while developing a deeper capacity for self-reflection, self-acceptance, and meaning-making. But of course, we analysts are as influenced by the cultures in which we live as anyone else. Certainly, as Muriel Dimon once said, culture saturates subjective experience. The cultural norm is that most people have children and most women want children. But I posit that there's also considerable pressure on them to feel this way, and the damage that results from this is enormous and far-reaching. How many of our patients are people who have suffered greatly because their parents reflexively reproduced without giving the choice careful consideration beforehand or confronting their ambivalence or misgivings? Over the years, I've heard a surprising number of stories from patients lamenting former therapists' reactions to their desire not to have children. In the beginning pages of her memoir, the comedian Jen Kirkman recounts a session in which she reveals to her therapist that she doesn't want children. Her therapist responds, "Why not? What's up with that?" And her therapist's response encapsulates many of the reactions my patients have reported. Kirkman writes, "My therapist suggested that instead of answering, 'I don't want kids,' that I should simply say, 'It's not in my plans right now.'" Oh boy, Kirkman says, she had no idea of what I was up against at every cocktail hour, wedding, shower, holiday party I've been to since I started to ovulate. Kirkman's therapist betrays her own personal and cultural bias here, as we're all prone to do, of course, despite our best intentions. As Corbett notes, rare is the club member who inquires about those outside the gate. But mental health professionals must inquire about those outside the gate. Like so many patients who present to treatment, Kirkman articulates her feelings about being an outlier, but her therapist responds in a way that is not only unattuned and unempathic, but hostile. I wish Kirkman's therapist had supported her patient's self-knowledge and self-determination, helped her navigate the societal pressure to conform, and encouraged her to respond directly to others' patronizing and invasive comments. Instead, the therapist protects and sides with the mainstream majority, thereby reinforcing the very social stigma against which her patient struggles. Kirkman's anecdote brings to mind an experience I had at a professional meeting a year or so ago. I was invited to present a paper on childlessness to an organization of mental health practitioners. After I finished speaking, you know where I'm going with this. Were you there?
I'm feeling.
After I finished speaking, a clinician in the audience, her voice oozing contempt, asked me to explain, quote, "Explain psychodynamically why a woman would choose not to have a baby." She wondered what diagnosis would be appropriate for such a woman.
Human.
Yes. I became tongue-tied in the moment. I was a bit dumbfounded with the question. But so right on cue, after I present this whole thing, by pathologizing women who opt out of motherhood, this clinician illustrated my argument that we have a responsibility to our patients and to ourselves to keep challenging our preconceptions, particularly regarding normativity. The analyst J.P. Chevrant makes a critical point about how the analyst's beliefs regarding what is normal can impact the patient. He says, frequently it is precisely patients' own struggles with social marginality and feelings of cultural incongruence that brings them into treatment. Psychoanalysis has a history of having acted thoughtlessly and at times cruelly in the arbitration of normality. As much as our theory has expanded and evolved, we sometimes still have a tendency to value certain traditional life choices as signs of developmental achievement. Concurrently, our cultural biases can consciously and unconsciously lead us to devalue non-traditional lifestyles and choices. By privileging certain life choices, we mirror and strengthen societal prejudices that tilt toward normality. And we do a disservice to our patients who feel like they don't fit in and those who feel like they must fit in.